We're recording.
Great. Okay. So it's a minute past the hour. Welcome, folks, if you are joining for the first time in any of the meetings of the Climate Council. I'm just going to ask someone to mute Rich, if they could. Great, thanks. Wonderful. So this is a bit of a special meeting today, inviting members of Vermont's Climate Council together with members of the public to have a webinar and a conversation and discussion around emerging ideas and the framing for the work around transportation that the Climate Council is doing and a task group inside that Climate Council is working on. My name is David Plum, and my role here is to help facilitate these meetings, and we are joined here by members of that task group that are working on transportation issues under the work of the Vermont Climate Council. And we also have Secretary Julie Moore from Agency of Natural Resources with us today to help in today's conversation. I'm just going to show a quick agenda slide here, Jane, if you want to move that forward. And our goal here today is to provide some information, and that's why we're doing 35 minutes of presentation. And Vermont Climate Council member Jared Duvall, and together with Secretary Moore, will be doing that presentation in just a moment. And that's trying to set the stage for the work that the council and this task group are leaning into for transportation issues in Vermont. And they'll give a little of the backstory, I imagine, about how there were some fundamental changes, right? As the Vermont Climate Council was finishing its initial climate action plan in December, that required the council to essentially say 2022 is a year in which we're going to look at some policy options around transportation for the state. So we're going to have that presentation. Another member of that task group, Joey Miller, will talk about some next steps. We're going to do a two-step process today because we have members of the council on this call with us, in addition to members of the public. If counselors have some clarifying questions, we'll do that. And then we're going to go into a conversation, and again, kind of a two-step process, first with the counselors, and then obviously everyone here, we want to invite you to be part of that conversation as well. We've got some framing questions there that I'll circle back to when it's time to do that, but keep those in mind as you listen to this presentation. What really does seem most promising, and what do you like most about the ideas that are emerging in this initial phase of this work, and where would you make it stronger, right? If something crucial is missing, a major policy options, it seems like a clear option that's not part of this discussion, that kind of thing. So keep those in mind as we are listening to the presentation. We're going to try to finish up after an hour and a half together today. Okay, so that's all that I had, except again, we're all together in this Zoom room, right? There's no differentiated participation. So just help us out with keeping yourself on mute unless you're talking. And, oftentimes in council meetings, we ask counselors if you're in a place to turn your camera on. That's great. I think in this meeting, because it's a little different, I don't mind if everybody if you're in a place where you want to have your camera on, that's great. But just try to make sure that's a place that's not distracting for everybody else. Okay, unless I missed something for folks who've helped put this meeting together, whether that's Jane or Jared or Joey or others or Gina, and if I missed something, shout out. If not, let's walk right into our presentation here with Secretary Moore and Jared Duvall. Great, looks good. Okay, Secretary Moore, are you going to kick things off here and do the first piece?
I am happy to do that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I have about 10 slides, mostly context and background, sort of what the current state is when it comes to transportation-related emissions in Vermont. And then we'll turn the floor over to Jared, who's going to present some of the options that are currently being discussed by the Transportation Working Group. Next slide, Jane. So as many of you are aware, the Climate Action Plan contains a set of recommendations for both the General Assembly and the Agency of Natural Resources, where I work, around how to go about meeting the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements established in the Global Warming Solutions Act, as well as directives to prioritize those actions towards those who are most affected, a commitment to update the Climate Action Plan every 4 years, and to create a framework for measuring and assessing progress as we go. And that is work that is underway at the agency as we speak. Another important piece of this was we adopted our initial Climate Action Plan on December 1st of this past year. And just a couple of weeks prior to that adoption taking place, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, and an initiative we'd been paying close attention to and in fact referenced in our climate plan, in some ways fell apart. And so this conversation today is really focused on what the alternatives are to occupying that space that the Transportation and Climate Initiative held in the Climate Action Plan. Next slide, Jane. And the reason transportation is important is because it is the largest source on a sector basis of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. It's represented by the green space on this graph here, and currently comprises about 40% of Vermont's annual greenhouse gas emissions. And if you could flip to the next slide, Jane. This is just another way at looking at it. Our inventory, our greenhouse gas emissions inventory that's maintained by the Agency of Natural Resources, usually has a couple of year lag in when it's produced. This is a reflection of the fact that we rely on both locally available, locally sourced data, as well as some regional data and work that's done by the Environmental Protection Agency in building out our full inventory. So this 2018 data is the last year for which we have that fully vetted set of numbers available to us. As I go on a little bit further in the presentation, I'm going to make reference to some preliminary data we have for more recent years, but 2018 is really the last year where we have the benefit of this full regional level analysis, and again shows transportation-related emissions account for about 40% of Vermont's contributions of greenhouse gases. Next slide. And within the transportation sector, about 95% of the way we fuel our ability to get around is with fossil fuels. There's the pie chart on the right-hand side of the slide gives a sense of how that breaks down between light duty, sort of personal use vehicles, and ones that more likely are being used for commercial purposes. But gives you a sense that overall our vehicle fleet here in Vermont and the miles traveled are really as a result of fossil fuel-based fuel use. Next slide, Jane. There are a lot of different ways we can look at how Vermonters are traveling. Probably the most meaningful is an estimate of total vehicle miles traveled. Our estimate is just north of 7.3 billion miles in 2019. There are more than 580,000 registered vehicles in Vermont. There are about 640,000 Vermonters, so that does indicate that some Vermonters have more than one registered vehicle, since not all of the 640,000 Vermonters are of driving age. And as of the end of 2021, of those 580,000 roughly vehicles, about 6,600 of them were either low emission or zero emission electric vehicles. On average, people are traveling more than 12,000 miles a year currently, and our best estimate of the overall fleet efficiency, so if you looked at all of the vehicles on the road in Vermont, is we average about 23 miles per gallon. As a result, That means Vermonters on average are purchasing about 550 gallons of fuel a year. And we just give some estimate of the costs associated with those fuel purchases depending on the price of gasoline. Obviously, the price of gasoline statewide at this point is above $4 a gallon, but it provides some useful perspective. And then finally, combining information on gallons of fuel used each year, we're able to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions per vehicle per year, which is approaching 5 metric tons. Next slide, please. So as I indicated, there is work being done in our air quality division, work being led by Colin Smythe and Megan O'Toole to look at producing some more current estimates of transportation emissions, sort of bringing forward the work that so far has been done through 2018. And the estimate they've produced is that current emissions from transportation are about 2.93 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. This is down significantly from the number in that 2018 survey and really reflects what we believe are both current events and recent trends. Recent trends being increased opportunities for many Vermonters to work from home and other changes in lifestyle that have occurred as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as changes in vehicle choice. And frankly, believe that these are both trends that have some staying power, both in terms of employers looking to sort of codify work from home opportunities, as well as increasing fuel prices and changes at the federal level in fuel efficiency standards that will hopefully help Vermonters select more fuel efficient vehicles. In addition, there are a number of other policies and programs that are sort of already on the books, from market-based programs, including the Advanced Clean Cars Initiative, which was established by the state of California, and we've signed on to the CAFE standards that I mentioned, as well as different incentives for electric vehicle purchase, both federal and state. Investments that are being made in infrastructure, both current and planned with different sources of state and federal funding, as well as efforts to encourage folks to look for smart growth opportunities, making our communities more walkable and bikeable with the hopes of driving down vehicle miles traveled. Next slide, Jane. The Climate Action Plan identified a range of different potential strategies around transportation, including expanding those incentives to encourage the purchase of electric vehicles, continuing to build out that charging station infrastructure and increase the number of publicly available charging stations in particular available throughout Vermont. Adopting the California Clean Car and Clean Truck rules. This is work that is currently underway at ANR. We're a little bit tacked and tied to the state of California and the progress they're making in this space, but believe we're on track to adopt it according to the timelines established in the Global Warming Solutions Act. This program would really begin implementation in 2026 and see that all vehicles delivered to Vermont by 2035 would meet a zero emission vehicle standard. The Climate Action Plan also made recommendations around seeking opportunities to electrify auxiliary systems, things like bucket trucks and refrigeration units associated with medium and heavy duty vehicles, recognizing that the vehicles themselves at this point have more limited opportunities to convert to electric. Again, continuing to look at ways to create infrastructure that helps get folks out of their cars, supports walking, biking, and public transit. And then also some education initiatives on the benefits of electrification and other transportation options that can further help Vermonters reduce vehicle miles traveled. So just talking a little bit more about the types of next steps, I did mention the California Advanced Clean Car and Clean Truck standards. In addition, there are really significant resources that are part of the FY23 budget currently being discussed at the legislature, including more than $37 million worth of investments for electric vehicle incentives, as well as expanded charging infrastructure. And this would be in addition to money through the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is sometimes also referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, that has $20 million for charging infrastructure to be administered by the Agency of Transportation. So combining the impact of these investments in charging infrastructure and incentives, the push that will be given to the market through the adopting the California Clean Car and Clean Truck standards, the question I leave you with is a little bit about what additional work is needed in this space to reduce emissions and actually meet the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And just my last slide, Jane. So we put together a chart to try to break this down. The 2.93 shown on the left-hand side there reflects our best estimate of current emissions for 2021. The 2.06 is the level we are required to achieve by the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so then blowing up that orange space between into the chart on the right, it shows that we expect of that 0.87 roughly metric ton reduction that's required, a little over a third of it is expected to be achieved through the adoption of the California Advanced Clean Car and Clean Truck rules. And then the red section, the balance, is areas of other potential policy need, including, I think, some of the ARPA and other investments the state is currently making. But so really the focus of the options that you're going to hear from the Transportation Working Group is in thinking about how to get at that red section of bar shown in the right-hand chart on the table. And with that, I will turn it over to Jared.
Thank you, Secretary Moore, and thank you everybody for joining. So as was discussed when we started, the transportation sector is in a bit of a unique place because it is different than some of our other major emitting sectors. You know, Vermont for a long time has had a policy, the renewable energy standard, that requires change over time that makes our electricity sector more renewable and reduces emissions. A similar performance standard policy was recommended in the Climate Action Plan and is under consideration by the legislature right now for the thermal sector with the clean heat standard. But for our transportation sector, which, as Secretary Moore said, is our most climate polluting sector, it lacks a similar primary or lead policy or regulatory framework to provide the lion's share of our needed emissions and help ensure with a high degree of confidence that we will meet the legally binding emissions reduction requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Now, this was not an oversight. The policy framework that was intended to provide the most significant progress of reducing transportation emissions, and that was recommended in our initial climate action plan, is the Transportation and Climate Initiative program. But in order for that program to move forward, it requires regional viability. And that means multiple states participating, at least 3. And I think it was a week and a half before our climate action plan was due on December 1st. We saw a number of states, first Connecticut, then Massachusetts and Rhode Island, withdraw their support from that program in succession. And so that leaves us in this position where we said we did not have time in that week and a half to identify another lead policy option to deliver the required emissions reduction in the transportation sector. So we said, if the Transportation and Climate Initiative does not achieve the regional viability necessary, then we will need to identify another option, and we want to be able to take time to deliberate on that as a climate council together. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that our transportation task group has started and that the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee conversation has been framed are, as we look across the country, as we look across the world, there is a lot of really important information and experience to draw on. And we looked at the studies that have been done, for instance, by the Regulatory Assistance Project, by Resources for the Future, by the Joint Fiscal Office, really assessing, what are the spectrum of policies that have existed and have been kind of proven to be able to meet multiple goals, both around emissions reduction, also around many of our equity priorities and concerns. And so this is not meant to be exhaustive. These options are not meant to be mutually exclusive or fully representative of the variety even under the certain categories. But just at a high level, want to start with 4 broad types of either economy-wide or sector-wide policy options. There's a part later in this presentation where we'll talk more specifically about specific policies or programs with relation to vehicles or fuels or transit. But this is meant to start at a much higher level of either economy-wide or sector-wide policy options. The first would be an emissions cap. There are many variations of this: cap and invest policies, cap and dividend policies, and they can either be an economy-wide cap on greenhouse gas emissions that ratchets down over time in alignment with legal requirements, or it could be a sector-specific cap. For instance, what we have for the electricity sector with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or that was proposed with the Transportation and Climate Initiative. It requires reductions below that cap, creating pollution allowances that are usually auctioned and purchased by polluters, and that decreases over time. So it's a price on the pollution and having to be under that cap. The other approach, which I sometimes think of as an inverse approach, because you are requiring positive action to be done, not allowing polluters to purchase allowances for their emissions. But the other approach is a performance standard, and that also requires emissions reductions, but the credits that it creates are for the positive emissions reducing actions, and it requires an increasing amount of activities that will reduce emissions over time. Another broad policy area is carbon pollution pricing, trying to internalize and reflect accurately in the price the true, complete social and environmental cost of things like fossil fuels. And then, of course, there is an approach around public investment and incentives. Secretary Moore was just speaking to this with many of the federal dollars that have come to Vermont. I think it's important to note there, though, that some of the key questions are: where do the revenues come from? And how do we ensure that those are stable and dedicated to provide market clarity over the short term versus just kind of a one-time either federal influx or a one-time kind of contribution from the state general fund, for instance. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we've been thinking about this is placing these broad policy options along a spectrum of confidence. And when it comes, and again, there is variety here. Each of these 4 can have higher or lower degrees of confidence depending on the exact design. But broadly speaking, what the example of carbon pricing and public investment approaches has been lower confidence in achieving emissions reduction. They can achieve higher confidence in other things in terms of what the expected price per ton would be, perhaps the amount of revenues raised or the revenues invested, but they generally do not provide a high degree of confidence around what we're legally required to achieve through the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is greenhouse gas emissions reduction. On the other side, the 2 broad policies that provide a very high degree of confidence around emissions reductions are emissions cap programs of various varieties and performance standards. Now, it's also true that when there is more clarity on the emissions reduction requirement, that can lead to less clarity or certainty on the price per ton. Next slide, please. So I want to walk through each of these broadly and on a few consistent criteria. So the first is that degree of confidence around emissions reduction. Emissions caps provide a very high degree of confidence. And with the annual reduction mechanism, the ability to hit 2025 and 2030 requirements as laid out in the Global Warming Solutions Act. When it comes to equity from a distributional perspective, at least, the question of whether it is progressive or regressive, who is bearing the cost, who is receiving the benefits, depends to an incredible degree on the design. You can design these programs to be either progressive or regressive. And a large part of that depends on how you use the revenues. You could imagine, for instance, a very progressive cap and invest program where folks who are under a certain household income have everything that they're paying into it refunded with a dividend. And so the only folks who are paying are wealthier folks. And you could also imagine that those funds paid in would be prioritized for things that would benefit low and moderate income folks. So that would be a very progressive approach. You could also, which I don't think we would ever want to do, and I certainly personally would not support, would be to design a regressive policy where you basically, didn't do either of those things. So in terms of examples that we can look to, economy-wide, there is a cap and invest program known as the Western Climate Initiative that exists in California, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. The electricity sector, we have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and the cap and invest approach was what the proposal was for the Transportation Climate Initiative program. There's also a cap and reduce program that has newly been passed and is moving forward in Oregon. And there's a cap and dividend approach that, to my understanding, is we do not have a US example of, but has been proposed. Next slide, please. So this is an example, a graphical example of how the cap and invest program through Transportation and Climate Initiative was meant to work. So if you think below that dark blue line, all of that pollution would have had to, the fossil fuel suppliers would have had to purchase allowances but they would have to come in under that line. That's what produces some of the certainty. Next slide, please. And then, this is a similar slide for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. You can see what the initial cap was up there in the dotted blue line, and then the more recent cap. I think it's an important policy. I hope Councillor Cowart will speak to this later, but these things also operate, they don't work in isolation. The effect of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative was also highly interactive with the renewable portfolio standards that existed in the electricity sector and other policies at the same time. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that I think about this, again, is that for an emissions cap policy, you have to come in under that line. And in our key compliance years for the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2025, 2030, and 2050, we'd have to be under those million metric ton amounts represented by those green dots on the graph. With a performance standard approach, you're basically drawing kind of an imaginary dotted line out from that 8.64 number. I'm sorry, I can't use my cursor. And saying that we have to, thank you for that, Jane, make sure that enough activity is happening to bring the numbers down to the 7.38, the 5.18, the 1.73. So they get you to the same place. It's just which side of that curve are you focused on with the policy. Next slide, please. So performance standards can provide a very high degree of confidence around emissions reductions when they're tied to a specific emissions reduction requirement. Again, whether they are progressive or regressive from a distributional perspective depends on the design. And for instance, with the clean heat standard, which is a proposed performance standard for the thermal sector, it's very intentionally proposed that a progressive share of the benefits of the clean heat services for Vermonters would go to low and moderate income Vermonters to a degree higher than their share of the population, because those are the folks from an equity perspective who we want to make sure are being served in achieving the savings benefits from a dollars perspective, the health benefits, because oftentimes their energy burdens are higher. Examples of where performance standards are in use. This varies by sector. For transportation, there's a low carbon fuel standard in California, the Clean Fuels Program in Oregon, and the Clean Fuel Standard in Washington. A number of other states are actively exploring these types of policies. It's a very common approach in the electricity sector. 30 states have renewable portfolio standards. It's a very common approach for energy efficiency with energy efficiency resource standards in 25 states. And in the thermal sector, it's also starting to gain ground with the state of Colorado having passed a clean heat standard last year, and that being a core recommendation of our climate action plan, the largest single emissions reduction proposal in our CAP last year and currently under consideration in the Vermont State Senate. Next slide, please. So these are just some maps that show you where some of these performance standards for other sectors are in place. So these are the electricity standards. Next slide, please. These are those energy efficiency resource standards. Next slide, please. This is a map of, this is already outdated. Washington State should be blue now, not green, and there are a number of additional states that are gray that should be green in terms of actively considering a low carbon fuel standard or a clean transportation standard, including states like New Mexico and Massachusetts. So this is constantly evolving, but I think the good news here is that with both cap and invest policies and with performance standard policies, there are a lot of other examples of peer states that we can look to for lessons learned, both what has worked well that we may want to replicate, including here in Vermont, of course, because we have a lot of experience with this with our own renewable energy standards and energy efficiency programs, but also where things have gone wrong that we need to be on guard against to make sure that there are not unintended consequences from program design, especially from an equity perspective. Next slide, please. So carbon pricing, sometimes called carbon pollution taxes or carbon pollution fees. These are kind of at the other end of the spectrum, or the certainty is flipped. You get more certainty on prices, somewhat less certainty on total revenues, and a much lower degree of certainty about actually achieving emissions reductions. Again, from an equity perspective, it depends on what you do with the revenue after it's raised, and it can be either progressive or regressive. And while there are 23 countries around the world, at least, that use a carbon pricing approach, they're not in use by any US states at this time. Next slide, please. So those are the broad kind of economy-wide, sector-wide type approaches that we have identified. A key question that we want to ask of all of you is, do you think there's anything that we are missing? That will be a focus later. But then there's also underneath those kind of specific policies and programs that fit into our pathways categorization in our climate action plan. And so those are the 6 pathways that were identified for transportation, and we can quickly go through. I don't think I'll have time to go through in detail each of them, but let's run through those next slides fairly. Next one, please, Jane. And so you can, and I've kind of categorized these in the parentheses afterwards in kind of 3 ways. One is I think there's 3 criteria here, or 3 different categories here. Was it recommended in the climate action plan? And if it was, has it been acted on, or is it in progress, like is the case for Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks? If it's been recommended but not acted on, that's important to know, and that some of those policies are bolded here. Like, for instance, the recommendation to the legislature to be ready to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative Program if regional market viability comes to exist. That is something that was recommended by the council in the Climate Action Plan, but that the legislature has not acted on. The same is true of a vehicle efficiency price adjustment. And then there's a third category of options that are not in the Climate Action Plan, oftentimes because we weren't aware of them at the time, but that may be things that we want to consider as we relook at transportation policy options. One of those just came to my attention today, thanks to Megan O'Toole in the Advanced Clean Fleets program that California is looking at. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the other, and this is, again, not meant to be fully inclusive. Some of these are to highlight some of the different options, but there could be others. Next slide, please. So every presentation I try to do, given my personal background and personal commitments, and given the commitments that I know members of this council have, is that this is not just about greenhouse gas emissions and climate targets. This is also about Vermonters, especially those who are struggling and face a high energy burden, and what do these policy questions mean for their budgets, and what does it mean for the Vermont economy? And overall, I think one of the really important things that we focus on is the opportunity, as we look at all of these policies, to save Vermonters a significant amount of money, lower those energy burdens, and keep more money recirculating and benefiting the Vermont economy and Vermont workers. And why is that? If we look at this slide, it shows both the higher cost and the much greater price volatility of gasoline and diesel. When we look at the cost of, and this is just the fuel cost or of charging, for electric vehicles, it is much lower and much more price stable, especially with off-peak charging rates that are offered by some utilities, as you see in those green dots. And of course, those lines should be above, the orange and blue lines should be up above $4 a gallon at this point. Next slide, please. And the other thing is that besides just what does this mean for consumers, this transition is also what does it mean for the Vermont economy? Fossil fuels are 100% imported into Vermont, and when we spend money on them as a commodity fuel, the vast majority of that money, on average, it varies by fuel, but on average, if you look at all of our fossil fuel spending, 75 cents of every dollar, nearly $1.5 billion every year drains out of the Vermont economy going to other places. In contrast, when we look at the alternatives, whether that is electrification, is keeping much more money local with line workers, tree trimmers, clean power producers, et cetera, that equation can flip, and we can keep many more dollars recirculating and growing the Vermont economy and Vermont jobs. So next slide, please, my last one. And that is why, so this is the final report on the pathways analysis that our consultants, Energy Futures Group and Cadmus, provided for the council. And what they looked at was, if we were to basically undertake all of the activity that would add up, that was modeled to add up to meeting our emissions reduction requirements, what would that mean for Vermont consumers and the Vermont economy? And while it is, of course, very true that this transition will involve significant upfront investment in our transportation sector, as you see in the orange there, in additional electricity generation as we electrify how we get around and heat our homes, there is a significant investment there. But there is also a very significant, even more so, savings when we look at avoiding all of that high cost, price volatile, polluting, not good for the Vermont economy, fossil fuel that you see in the blue there. And when you net those out, including the avoided social and economic, the social and environmental damages, the net modeled expected benefit to Vermont of meeting our emissions reduction requirements is a net savings of over $6 billion. So that, I think, that report came out after we had passed the climate action plan, didn't get a lot of attention, but that is a very important piece of this story, that what we're talking about here is not just reducing emissions, but what does that mean for saving Vermonters money and strengthening the Vermont economy over time. The last thing I would say, I think the question that we all need to wrestle with, and this is both as a council and as individual councilors, is what is the degree of confidence that we either want or need in terms of meeting the overall emissions reduction requirements that were kind of charged to us with the Global Warming Solutions Act, and kind of sector by sector. And I think that this is actually both a legal question and a personal decision. And I think we are going to need additional counsel on, what degree of confidence do we need to have that we're going to meet the requirements to meet our legal responsibility as counselors. I think we can also think about it from a personal perspective. And I will say, just personally, that my feeling is that as I look at these policy options now, the only two buckets that I am comfortable looking at are emissions cap programs or performance standard programs, because otherwise I do not think that we will be able to update the climate action plan in a way that we could feel comfortable signing off on it, having the assurance that our recommendations would actually end up meeting the legally binding requirements. A lot of the other things could be positive things, but we would not know until after the fact in adding up a lot of different puzzle pieces. Whereas those other two approaches provide much more of an umbrella certainty, either economy-wide or sector-wide. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. Thanks so much, Jared and Secretary Moore. Okay, so that was that 40-minute presentation we said would happen. And now we wanted to have another task force member, Joey Miller, tell us a little bit about the next steps that their group is working on over the coming months. So Joey, over to you, please.
Sure. Thanks, David. Thank you, Secretary Moore. Thanks, Jared, for the context setting and sort of the baseline setting for this conversation and the work ahead. And more so, thanks for everyone for joining us today, because this will be a big team effort as we're sort of back to the drawing board, assessing, the need and the opportunities before us and the gap we are likely going to need to fill with some other regulatory or policy measure. And that needs to be informed by your input today and input over the course of time as we dig into this work. So I want to just walk through our thinking and sort of the, timeline that we anticipate to date before we pivot off into a discussion where we really do hope in that discussion you will share with us your input on, again, as Jared and Secretary Moore said, what are the things do we, should we be considering as we ramp this work, both in the sort of policy or regulatory tools and in the sort of considerations that we need to hold close as we move forward. So we are starting with this sort of high level conversation today. And then our intention is in the next, month and a half to go sort of take a deeper dive into some of the strategies that you just heard Jared articulate. That first one begins on April 5th at 1:30 p.m., hosted by the Vermont Clean Cities Coalition. Vermont Clean Cities is hosting a webinar looking at a clean transportation standard that, as Jared shared with you, several states have pursued. So I'm going to ask, I see Peggy O'Neill-Vivanco on this webinar. If Peggy, you can drop information about that event into the chat, that would be great. That's our first sort of partner deep dive overview into a performance-based standard that we very well are going to explore. And then, again, informed by what you suggest, we're going to set up a couple of other, at least one other deep dives into cap and invest-based programs. As you heard, Transportation and Climate Initiative was a leading sort of regulatory tool that we had put forward in the plan. That sort of is on ice, and other states like us who have required emissions reductions are sort of at the same sort of drawing board, looking at what other options that they can explore and or advance. So we're going to set up, and we will keep you posted on another deep dive on cap and invest. And again, if there are other policy or regulatory tools you think we should dig deeper into, we're going to hear from you today, and then we're going to try and set those in motion to deliver by the end of May. To inform our technical analysis and ongoing public engagement. I did want to flag for you too that just to continue to inform the Climate Council's work more broadly. There will be a couple of upcoming public engagement events on April 12th and April 13th. And I'm wondering if Marion or Jane, you can drop information about those upcoming events. Those are sort of broader context setting about the work in general, the very broad, comprehensive work of the council. So really looking forward to having you all and your networks inform that. So hopefully you can join us there. Beyond that, there is a parallel process to help us understand through a technical analysis, the sort of suite of options and strategies and how they, would add up or help us fill any potential gap. So right now, the Agency of Natural Resources is putting an RFP out there to ask someone to partner with us, a contractor to partner with us to undertake that technical analysis. That RFP will be issued by mid-April, ideally a consultant hired by early June. They will build from, as you heard Secretary Moore outline, sort of the baseline work of where we anticipate the advanced clean cars and advanced clean trucks rulemaking and regulatory programs to take us. And that's also another important part of our public engagement work, which I will highlight in just one second. But moving forward from there, at the June 2022 council meeting, it's our hope that we can, I see several council members here today, provide the full council an update on the work that we're doing, the progress we've made, and the further work we need to do to ultimately set the stage for a potential proposed recommendation to potentially amend the climate action plan with a new recommendation or more than one recommendation. So that is intended for the June 2022 council meeting. Simultaneously, as we noted, the rulemaking for advanced clean cars 2 and advanced clean trucks is underway. That it has, along with it, that rulemaking process, a very robust public engagement component. So we are really looking to sort of, ensure that Vermonters are engaged in that rulemaking process and engaged in that public sort of discourse, working with a technical consultant and with the task group and with council members and you all to ensure Vermonters are participating in that process, and that informs our broader transportation work in general. So that will happen over the summer. So summer and early fall, we're going to continue to sort of loop back to you all to do further stakeholder and public engagement, ideally informed by the draft technical analysis. And then mid to late October, we anticipate, it's our hope that the consultant will deliver a technical analysis and that we can sort of roll that out to you all, get some public input, and have that inform a suggested recommendation to the Climate Council. And ideally, sort of by November, there will be Climate Council deliberations and considerations of potential needs or opportunities to amend the climate action plan to fill in the gap that we currently have without a regulatory or policy tool that will deliver the certain pollution reduction progress that you heard Jared articulate and that we know we need to deliver in terms of the legal obligations of the Global Warming Solutions Act. So this is our sort of initial draft plan. It's something we will very much look forward to keeping you abreast of, and to the degree you and or your networks are able to continue to partner in and participate with us, we will keep you abreast of those opportunities. But this will give you a general sense of what we are looking to do, a big piece of work in fairly short order. And so we're going to look forward to partnering with you all to do it. And the conversation we're about to have, I'm going to turn it back over to you, David, will really inform this broadly. So your input on all of this that you just heard is very much welcome and appreciated.
Great. So that's the pathway forward. Thanks for that, Joey. All right. So we wanted to create, before we get into an actual sort of discussion, we wanted to create a space if particularly members of the Climate Council had clarifying questions, things that aren't particularly clear, they'd just like a little more information. Let's do a few of those if we have that. And then let's get into a discussion where we can be guided by those questions I signaled earlier. And I noticed that there has been some conversation in the chat, and those are the kinds of issues we should lift up in the discussion. Like really, how do these issues address our core interests and concerns? But let's start with the clarifying questions. Particularly members of the council who are joining us today, are there any questions you have for any of the presenters today or members of the task group that have been trying to wrestle with these issues. Any clarifying questions for folks? And we'll just use that Zoom raise hand feature, if you don't mind, because we're a pretty big number today. Also, if you turn your camera on and wave at me, I might be able to see you as well. But any clarifying questions for our presenters today? Rich?
Well, I'm following up on something that Jared said and asked me to comment on. So, or I can ask him the question and he can comment on it as whatever he wishes.
Okay.
Can you say a few words, Jared, about the difference between the cost per ton that's reported in some of the carbon trading schemes and the actual cost to reduce a ton associated with a program or a set of programs?
Thanks, Rich. I want to briefly offer something, but then I'd like to turn it back over to you because this is something that you have studied more closely than I have, and I think your perspective is really important. I want to say that the memo that I actually just linked in the chat, I think there is a mistake in there that is my fault, because it does kind of compare just on a price per ton basis some of the prices we see in the cap and invest markets versus some of the prices for credits we see in the performance standard markets. And Rich is exactly right, that those prices for credits or for allowances are not necessarily the same thing as the cost of reducing a ton of greenhouse gases, because, for instance, there is an interplay between these things. And I think it's very likely that the price per ton in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative market would not be nearly as low as it is if there weren't other complementary policies that exist to provide market certainty and bring those costs lower, like all of the renewable portfolio standards in the region. But I would stop there and ask you to elaborate more on that, Rich, because I think it's a very important point, and I don't think it's addressed as clearly and well as possible in the memo that we shared ahead of this meeting.
Okay, well, first I want to say that I think the presentations that you all just went through are really good, and that the work plan that Joey sketched out looks good to me. And so I don't want to sound like I'm being critical, because I'm not. And one of the things that you all are making really clear is that a mix of policies is going to be required in order to achieve reductions in any of these major sectors. And as you just mentioned, Jared, in electricity, we have renewable portfolio standards, and we have efficiency requirements, and we have RGGI, and they work in concert. And as you said, if we were relying on the carbon price alone in RGGI to drive investments in renewables and efficiency, the carbon price would be a way different number than what it has been. And this is true for any carbon pricing regime anywhere. So that's one point. The second point is that to maximize fairness, equity, and to minimize regressivity in any of these programs, we need to look both at how signals, including price signals, but also other kinds of incentives are delivered, and to whom benefits are given. And so, again, there's another overlay here which has to do with fairness that has to be built into the mix of policies. And I'm sure that you all are going to study that. I mean, you're going to study both this idea that there's a mix of policies, and secondly, there's a mix of progressive policies that help to make the programs work better. And third, then we can measure how much does it cost consumers, people, regular folks and businesses, how much does it cost people to avoid or reduce a ton of emissions? And that's what I hope your analysis will reveal as you put together a package of policies. And just simply looking at what's the cost per ton in some trading market, that's not going to answer that question. Thanks for allowing me to say that.
Great. Thanks for that. So if there are no other sort of clarifying questions out there, let's just go right into our discussion. Just because this is something of a council meeting, I want to just give a space for counselors to go first, and then let's open up to everybody. So climate counselors, we'd love to hear some reactions from you. We have these two framing questions that I named at the top, and I'm just dropping them again in the chat. And one is more sort of building on the strengths of what you heard, right? What seems most promising? What do you like most about it? And the other is more like, what would you do differently here? What would make it stronger? What's missing? So let's start with members of Vermont's Climate Council, and then let's open it wider. Reactions, thoughts to these two questions, things that you think this task group should be keeping front and center. Go ahead and raise hands if you don't mind, or make some signal that you'd like to make a comment. June, go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I've noted, or afternoon, I guess, at this point. I noted in the chat that there's a labor organization that is speaking up. And I wonder at what point the approach that is being articulated there will be reviewed, considered, evaluated. And the reason I ask is simply this. I'm aware that in our climate plan writ large, we had virtually no discussion about the role of nuclear fuel or natural gas. And that left the plan open to criticism that it was very one-sided in its approach. So I am not stating a position here today, one way or another, as to whether I think those fuels are the solution. I am citing it as an example for something that I think we need to think about in this space, because this too will be scrutinized by people who are outside of the circles that we are traveling in and developing this thinking. And I just want to flag that there is confidence to be built in our process when we show that we are aware of those perspectives as well, and that we give them due consideration as well.
Thanks, June. And I hope to really talk about it now too, right? Bram, go ahead.
Thank you. And, I'm raising my hand here because I did chat a little bit in the chat with the Vermont State Labor Council. And we just, sort of very briefly want to expand that conversation. The sort of summary of the suggestion was regulate energy directly, and tax the rich, and use the money from taxing the rich to weatherize and do all these other things. And I would say that in general, two things. We have certainly considered that, and I think we are very sensitive to the fact that there's a large body of thinking that suggests that changes in federal tax policy over the past 40 years have increased inequality in this country, and that is something that's very important that we as a society address. However, straight regulation of pollution tends to be a less efficient way, because there are some sources of pollution for whom it's pretty cheap to get rid of a ton of carbon dioxide, and other sources for which it's really expensive. And you can get more reduction for each dollar you're putting towards it by creating a more flexible system that allows the reductions to come where it's cheapest and easiest first. So I think that's why we have not brought forward a straight, let's just regulate down pollution proposal.
Thanks,
Well,
Bram.
I just want to make sure I understand that, Bram. So are you saying that it will receive no further consideration?
I am neither saying that nor would have
Okay.
any authority to do that. So no, I
Okay,
think
so fair enough. So my question stands, how do people like the labor group here ensure that their viewpoint is duly considered, or has that train already left the station? And
no,
I
I
don't know
think
that I'm directing that at you. I'm just,
yeah, no,
this is an
and I was
open
gonna,
discussion, so I'm bringing it out.
yes, no, I think it's a great point. And I would sort of defer to the people who have spent more time creating the public engagement process for this year as probably the best place to describe the areas where viewpoints like that can be heard and engaged and absorbed.
All right, thank you.
Great. Gina, you have your hand up, and then I really want to lean into this issue and pull everybody into it, whether you're a counselor or not. Go ahead, Gina.
Well, I just want to say that what Joey described as the process is the tip of the iceberg. There is going to be robust public discussion of these policies as they become clearer. Right now, it's all very high level and fuzzy. And as we delve in deeper at all the stages along the way, the labor unions, anybody who wants to get involved is going to get involved in this. So I can't emphasize that enough. We're so rushed last year with the cap. We can think about this process systematically this time, and we are going to have a robust public involvement. So I'm
That's great.
just maybe stating the obvious for June and everyone else.
Well, I want to distinguish though between public involvement as in public engagement, taking people's temperatures, and people having seats at the table with the substantive policy discussion. Because to me, the two are not quite the same.
Well, that's something for the council to consider.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Bram, your hand came back up.
Indeed, it did. I just wanted to address one other thing that the Vermont State Labor Council brought up, which is the sense that some of these policies have been enacted in California and have had negative effects on the BIPOC community in particular, the Vermont State Labor Council brought up, and have also not been particularly effective in reducing emissions. And also wanted to simply address that by saying that we are, I think, fully committed as a council to making sure that what we do helps and improves things in the BIPOC community and other traditionally marginalized communities, and are certainly very desirous of learning from the experience of other states like California, what has worked and what hasn't, and making sure that we learn from that and do better.
Great. So I'm curious. I think this issue, it feels like there's half going on in the chat and half going on in the reality in the voice. So I wonder if we want to pull it all into the voice right now. And I want to lean right into what's being suggested here, that maybe there's an area of work that's not getting enough attention, this area of work, whether it's direct regulation or something like that. So I would invite the voices that are in the chat right now, if you want to raise your hand and explain a little bit more, like what's the area of work that's not getting the attention it needs? And I'd welcome some discussion around that. So I see a hand up, and I just see the institutional name. I don't see an actual person's name. So I welcome you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much. My name is Liz Medina. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont State Labor Council. Sorry, I've been on and off this call because I am traveling to various shops as part of my job to talk to workers directly. And I am their voice when they can't be here themselves. So I did mostly put my concerns in the chat because I wasn't sure they would be addressed, because I understand the council was being prioritized, and I just wanted to make sure those comments and critiques were at least heard. And I thank June for making the distinction between having a seat at the table versus public comment as well. And I think, so far I understand there's a lot of policy considerations, but I think what I've seen today is largely an indirect carbon pricing on various frameworks. And I have very strong critiques that are backed up by evidence of those policies. And I haven't heard anything yet that convinces me I'm not right in having these critiques. And so I think an area that deserves more attention is looking at direct regulation. And what is the cost and what do we need to do to make it happen? This is not something new. We've directly regulated to protect the environment many times in our history as a country, and I'm sure as a state. And I also would like to really think about equity, and carbon pricing is not equity, even if you use some of those revenues to give to lower income individuals to transition. That's not really doing enough. And oftentimes those projects are means tested and you miss a lot of people. And so I think we really need to see a redistribution of wealth, and we need to look at taxing the rich in this state, starting with something like maybe raising property taxes on second homeowners. That could bring in considerable revenues. It's being considered by Rhode Island for their green justice zone projects. And inequality is part of the reason why we have a crisis too, to begin with. We know that it is the wealthiest that are polluting the most. So I think this is integral to the discussion. It's not receiving enough attention. I'd really like to see more options than just more carbon pricing. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate you articulating that. Okay. This is an opportunity if we want to keep leaning in a little bit more on this issue, and then I want to make sure we go to other issues as well. On the issue of direct regulation, others want to weigh in, provide some advice to the task group as they continue their work. Dave, you want to go ahead with that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first I'd like to, I really want to commend Joey and Gina and that this transportation subgroup for all the work they were doing. This was an exhausting undertaking this last year up till December. And they got thrown from the TCI horse at the last moment. They got back on the horse and they've continued their work. I think I'm just really inspired by the hard work they're doing. This observation, the climate action plan work is focused on big and sustainable policies that'll help change the state's economy and the transportation sector. But given that we're revisiting all these things due in part to the failure of states to join TCI and give us a funding mechanism to get things going, I'd recommend that we consider some smaller but more easily adopted policies as well in these discussions that would reduce transportation sector greenhouse gases and other emissions. I'll give one example. This would be lowering and enforcing a speed limit for Class 8 trucks on Vermont highways. Lowering the speed limit for 18-wheelers. Vermont has the authority to adjust the speed limits on Route 89, Route 91. This would avoid significant amounts of fossil fuel, not just fuel that's bought in state, but obviously fuel that's brought into state from these trucks that are traveling through our state. This could be adopted for a short term. This doesn't have to be something that's put in place forever. A period of a few years to start Vermont on its transportation sector greenhouse gas reduction path. So before decisions are made, I would really hope that that we have a discussion with the Department of Transportation, ask them what would doing this cost? How quickly could doing this be implemented? How many tons of CO2 would be avoided? I'd recommend asking EJ communities and the Agency of Natural Resources what other pollutants could be avoided, for instance, by lowering Class 8 truck speed limits from 65 to 55 and enforcing that. This could be a demand side, polluter pays, very low cost, high yield, Jared, high confidence start on those 2025 goals and the broader longer term transportation policies and change in this sector we're seeking.
Great. Okay, Dave. So that's another idea you want to put on the table. Thank you for doing that. It's okay if we jump around a little bit. It's great also if you want to reference these other ideas, right? So we've talked a little bit about direct regulation. Dave puts another idea around speed limits for 18-wheelers. Dale, over to you, please.
Thank you. And yeah, I actually would like to build off of the comments from Liz Medina and Dave Farnsworth and talk about some other ideas that I think are worthy of consideration. I want to point out that there's something in the climate action plan that does not seem to have gotten any follow through that I've seen. I certainly didn't hear anything about it today. And that is creating a sustainable transportation plan. There's been next to no conversation about how we can reduce our vehicle miles of travel. There are some good ideas out there for it, but that's something that I think this group ought to be focused on and ought to be holding VTrans accountable for. Likewise, there's ideas out there, for example, earlier today, someone briefly mentioned the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation from California that would start to clean up our commercial fleets and our public fleets. California also has an innovative clean transit regulation that we should be looking at, where every transit agency does a transition plan and they have interim purchase requirements and, you know, a deadline by which all transit vehicles would be zero emission vehicles. I think it's really important for us to be focused on and doing everything we can to get zero emission school buses out there. I think that is a really important health issue and equity issue. And those kids who are inhaling those diesel fumes will be paying that price for their lives, for the duration of their lives. And if we can get those vehicles cleaned up, we will be doing a huge service for our future. Also want to point out that the Comprehensive Energy Plan has in it Vermont State Agency Energy Plan, and that talks about beefing up the state vehicle purchases to include more electric vehicles and setting some deadlines for us to green our entire state fleet, both through BGS and through VTrans. And I think that if we put all of these things together, we will be getting a lot done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. Appreciate those comments. That's great. Jared, did you want to comment on something here?
Yeah, thanks, David. I want to thank Liz as well for her comments and suggestions. And I just want to reflect on them briefly, because I think that what we can do from a regulatory perspective and what we can do via tax policy are really important parts of this conversation. And I just want to share kind of a starting point assumption I have that I may be wrong, but I want to put it out there for why I think those, while valuable to look at, my assumption is they will likely be insufficient on their own. If we look at where our emissions come from, I think Secretary Moore showed this slide at the beginning. You know, the vast majority, over 70% of our emissions come from our light duty vehicles. My understanding is that legally, Vermont has two options for regulating vehicle sales and fuel efficiency standards. Either we use the federal standards or we use California standards. We are not legally allowed to create our own. We are already following California standards, and it was a proposal in the Climate Action Plan that we join Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks. So my sense is that we are already pursuing a regulatory pathway, certainly in the area of the largest reductions. And so, but the challenge is that doesn't get us there. It's not enough on its own. It's only a third of the overall reductions that we need from this sector. And so to me, the question is, yes, there may be other regulatory options, but we're pursuing the most obvious one as we can, but there's still more that's needed. In terms of tax policy, I don't think the council has discussed it. I think the council should. I will say that I personally very much appreciated and very much agree with the Vermont Green New Deal proposals that looked at returning to the Obama era tax rates on the wealthiest Vermonters, overturning the Trump era tax cuts for the wealthiest, and investing that directly in and cost-saving measures for low and moderate income Vermonters. I do think that we should look at that, and that may be actually a potential opportunity to have a more stable source of funding for weatherization, which is, as it's structured now, perhaps going to drop off after the ARPA investments run out in 2026. So I think that those are really important and valuable additions to the conversation. I think the challenge is we're already advancing the most obvious, highest impact regulation we could find, and it's not enough. And that even, there is a limit to how much tax policy can do as well. And I do think that in order to have the legal and moral certainty we're looking for around emissions reductions and a just transition, there need to be other options on the table as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jared. And all right, so this is an opportunity for, I know if you haven't seen already, all of us, whoever's here in this webinar, if you have some reflections about what you're particularly liking about what you're seeing or what you think would make it stronger, let's go ahead and lift those up. If folks have other reactions, maybe things that haven't been said yet today, other thoughts that folks have about what we're hearing. Anything else? Charles, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to raise again the issues of public transit and alternatives to cars, and also the issues of encouraging zoning regulations that work toward clusters of where people live instead of the expanded, everybody have their 10 acres of land and therefore have to drive more. So that I didn't hear hardly anything about public transit being raised, and maybe that's part of the plan, but I'm really concerned about that. And with an aging population, there are reasons for people like me to be off the road in a few years and still need to have a way to get around. So I think public transit is a big piece to be looking at, and a tough one.
Thanks, Charles, for mentioning those two pieces around public transportation and zoning around compact settlement and those issues. Gina, did you want to comment directly on those?
Yes. Well, I put in the chat, and as I understand it, VTrans is embarking on some very important work around VMT reductions and emissions, and that's going to take place in the next several months. That should be the underpinning of the sustainable transportation planning work that Dale mentioned and is in the CAP. So if Andrea or Joe or others who are here on the call from VTrans could very briefly summarize what's going on, I think that would be good for this group to hear.
Thanks, Gina. If folks are in a position to do that from VTrans, that'd be great. I don't know if you're able to do that right now.
Sure, I can do that quickly. Hi, everybody. Joe Segali from the Agency of Transportation. Yes, we just will be starting the study of VMT and smart growth soon. We've just picked a consultant. We're doing it actually under our research program. And so that's getting underway now. The question of the sustainable transportation plan is a great question. We actually were talking about that this morning. And it's somewhat related to what we need to do for the IIJA as well, which provides an option for us to develop a resilience plan, a transportation resilience plan. And that can be wrapped into, I think, the sustainable transportation plan, as well as what we're doing with electric vehicles and everything else. So that's definitely on our radar, Dale. I want you to know that, but we can't do everything all at once, but we will eventually get there.
Okay, great. Thanks. And folks who are on the Climate Council, I'd be curious, and on the task group in particular, the questions around public transportation, and I saw something in the chat about it as well. There were a series of recommendations in the initial climate action plan around public transportation, right? And I'm just curious how that is part or not part of your work now in the task group as you're going forward, the public transportation issues. So Joey or Jared or Gina, yeah.
Well, the first step is to understand the emissions benefits of investing in transit. And that's what we're hoping the sustainable transportation plan will do for us. We have to wrap our heads around what are the emissions benefits of our transit programs. And they have other benefits too, because they're very important for people to get to work. So who can't afford to or don't have cars. So we need to do both. We need to understand the emissions benefits of the programs that are in Vermont now. And then we need to invest wisely to increase those programs so we can reap the emissions benefits that are demonstrated and the social benefits.
Got it. Okay, thanks, Gina. That's helpful. Jared, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly, I think going back to the questions about what role can transit and other kind of smart growth strategies and ways to reduce vehicle miles traveled, I think those fit squarely within the CAP and invest and performance standard programs. What we've seen across the country and the world is that with cap and invest programs, it creates revenue to invest in expansions of public transit or of microtransit or on-demand microtransit or other infrastructure that helps folks not drive. What we've seen in Oregon and California in their performance standard programs is that credits are provided for expanding those services. And it's not just things going to electric vehicles and vehicle charging. That's a big part of it. But it's really on a common metric of what can we do to reduce emissions across the board. And if we can do that in other things that aren't just about vehicles, those are equally at the table or meant to be and should be when we consider those broad, big picture sector-wide policies.
Great, thanks. Okay. So any final thoughts, things that you'd really want this task group to take away from this conversation that haven't already been said? Things that are important as they go forward in their work? Anything else folks want to share? Okay. Great. So this is great. We've had a couple important themes come across in this discussion, right? The theme about how you're raising revenue, right? The theme about, direct regulation and how that may be more or less part of the story, and some requests for more information from the task group on that. That's an important theme that we've talked about. Some specific suggestions were brought up, whether it's speed restrictions for trucks, or making sure we're making progress on a sustainable transportation plan and the work around reducing vehicle miles traveled, the role of public transportation in all this story, and wanting to see that more visible. Those are among the issues that we've seen today. Great. I would just say it looks like we're kind of reaching a conclusion here of our meeting. I think for task group members or others, any final thoughts you'd like to offer before we finish up? Sue, Minter?
Yeah, thank you all. Obviously, these are a lot of big and intense and complicated factors, and I so appreciate everyone's hard work. I wanted to just lift up because as, on the Just Transitions Committee, so many of these issues obviously are very integral to our work. And Joey, you mentioned a few meetings upcoming, and I guess that was raised early on, especially, this difference between the meetings that are to engage new people in even understanding what climate change is and how it's affecting us to the kind of conversations around rich and difficult policy questions that we're having together here. And I guess I'm curious, I think the steering committee will be talking about this on Monday, and I should be more informed, frankly, about what's being planned. But I know, Joey, you said a few meetings coming up, and I'm aware that there are these maybe parallel tracks of engaging And I'm wondering if we want to give some more thought to that before the steering committee on Monday. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Joey?
Well, actually, that's a great segue, Sue, because I was just going to remind folks that there are some events coming up. April 5th, deep dive on clean transportation standard, April 12th and 13th, these bigger, broader public engagement events. But then I might lean on Jane. It may be helpful just based on what Sue just said to give people a flavor of the 3 different prongs to the public engagement. Can you do that very briefly?
Happy to. As Sue alluded to, and now Joey's following up on, the public engagement strategy that we're trying to work through right now comprised of 3 main components, one of which is making the plan more accessible to all Vermonters, and we have a multi-pronged approach within that space in and of itself, which includes translation services, visual story maps, access through oral translation of components that are also translated in different languages. So that's a bucket that myself and Marian Wolf are really moving forward with as agency staff. And then we have 2 other buckets around the more traditional broad-based engagement, what the state typically does. And those are the events coming up on the 12th and 13th. But the intent of those, rather than to really talk at the public about what's in the plan, is to provide a space about an update on where the council is going and what the substantive areas of work are that are still exist for the council, and allow for authentic feedback from Vermonters to help guide the council in the direction it takes in 2022 and beyond, since the council is an everlasting body to help guide this work. And then finally, as Sue started to mention, we also appreciate that those efforts won't reach everybody, and in fact they'll likely not reach even more Vermonters than we want. And so we're also thinking really thoughtfully about what partner engagement looks like and how we build long-term relationships, especially prioritized with frontline and impacted communities, to go long and deep and have a rich conversation about what the barriers are to putting forward solutions that help us in our climate space. So that's just starting. And that's a long endeavor that we're just starting to build a framework for, starting to identify the communities that we want to work with, the partners to help us get in there, and have those conversations into the future at the council and beyond. So yeah, I dropped again in the chat to bring it forward, the link for the events on the 12th and 13th. And transportation is one of those substantive areas of work that we'll focus in on, but there are others, and we appreciate folks joining us for those events as well to learn about the ongoing work this year.
Super. That's great, thanks. And just in complementing those 3 prongs of the public engagement work, clearly on this transportation work, there's going to be some other specific things like what Joey mentioned for upcoming conversations, Joey, that you talked about. So there will be some of these other more sort of very substantive specific issue, conversations going up, and we'll try to keep people appraised of those when they happen. Okay, great. Well, this is great. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate folks leaning into this conversation. Appreciate presenters for laying out the work and the task group for carrying this work forward. And please do stay in touch by checking on the website. There's a really great calendar on the website that really shows everything that's happening. So take a look at that calendar for upcoming material if you don't have that. And maybe Jane, if there's some way to sign up for email updates, let people know about that as well. That's it for us today. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully it's a nice weekend. And thanks for all your input in this call. Take care, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.